A decorated Black Army general, returning home from serving his country, is humiliated by a racist arrest. Just as his world is turned upside down, former President Donald Trump steps in, taking a stand that shocks the nation. What happens next will ignite protests, spark reform, and leave everyone questioning how justice is truly served. The camera pans over a bustling press conference held at a grand event hall in Washington, D.C. The room buzzes with the chatter of reporters, the click of cameras, and the shuffle of notes being prepared for questions. Standing at the podium, framed by the American flag and a banner reading Veterans First, is former President Donald Trump. His expression is focused, his tone commanding yet reflective as he addresses the crowd. Our military men and women sacrifice everything to protect the freedoms we hold dear, Trump begins, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. They don't just serve their country, they inspire it. And we owe them more than our gratitude, we owe them our respect, our support, and a system that values their sacrifices. The applause is thunderous. In the audience, veterans of all ages nod in agreement, their medals gleaming under the bright lights. Trump pauses, letting the moment settle before continuing. Today, I want to remind everyone that these heroes are the backbone of America. They've faced enemies abroad. They shouldn't face injustice here at home. As his words echo across the room, the story shifts to another part of the country, Columbus, Ohio. The scene transitions to General Marcus Davis driving along a quiet suburban road. The glow of the streetlights casts long shadows across his car, illuminating the military fatigues he still wears from his recent humanitarian missions. His face is calm, yet his eyes hold the weight of a man who has seen both the best and worst of humanity. For Davis, this drive home is more than a commute. It's a return to peace after months of rebuilding communities in war-torn regions. He thinks about his wife, Angela, and his 2 children, eagerly waiting for him. His daughter's text message about her upcoming school play flashes through his mind, bringing a rare smile to his lips. The car radio hums softly with an old jazz tune, a familiar comfort after months of distant sirens and cries for help. The warmth of the moment, however, is undercut by a growing tension. In the rearview mirror, Davis notices a police car trailing him. The flashbacks begin. Davis as a young boy in a modest neighborhood, raised by parents who taught him the value of discipline and integrity. Then, as a young cadet, excelling in the academy against all odds. The images flow quickly: his promotion to general, speeches at international forums, and his tireless work to aid civilians caught in crisis. Now, back in the present, Davis grips the steering wheel a little tighter as the police car's headlights stay fixed on him. The warmth of homecoming begins to fade, replaced by a familiar unease. Just a routine patrol, he murmurs to himself, forcing calm. The juxtaposition of Davis's dignified past and the subtle, simmering tension in the present sets the stage. The officer tailing him remains unseen for now, a shadowy figure in a world where even heroes aren't immune to prejudice. The moon hung low over the quiet suburban road as General Marcus Davis navigated the familiar streets of his hometown. It was late, and he had just returned from an overseas mission. His mind wandered to his family, who were eagerly awaiting him. The faint glow of streetlights illuminated the empty road ahead, their flicker a serene contrast to the chaos he had recently left behind in war-torn regions. But this peace was fleeting. Behind him, a pair of red and blue lights flared to life, accompanied by the sharp wail of a siren. Davis's brows furrowed as he glanced in his rearview mirror. He signaled, pulling to the side of the road. A fleeting thought reassured him he had done nothing wrong. Officer Blake, a burly man with a stern expression and a badge that caught the light, approached the vehicle. His flashlight swept across the interior of Davis's car, the beam landing on the general's face. "License and registration," Blake barked, his tone cold and clipped. Davis complied immediately, his movements deliberate and calm. "Evening, officer. Is there a problem?" His voice was steady, the product of years of commanding troops under fire. Blake's eyes narrowed as he scanned Davis's military identification and driver's license. "What are you doing here?" "I'm heading home, officer. I just returned from a mission overseas," Davis replied, maintaining his composure. Blake's demeanor shifted, suspicion clouding his expression. "This your car?" he asked, the tone implying doubt. "Yes," Davis answered. "It's registered in my name." But Blake wasn't convinced. His gaze lingered on Davis's uniform, the fatigue still bearing the dust of his travels. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand resting ominously on his holstered gun. Davis hesitated, not out of defiance but disbelief. "Is there a reason for this?" Blake's tone hardened. "Step out of the vehicle. Now." With a measured breath, Davis opened the door and stepped into the cool night air. His hands were visible, his movements slow, a calculated effort to de-escalate the situation. But Blake's hostility only seemed to intensify. "You got anything in the car I should know about?" Blake asked, circling Davis like a predator. "No, sir. Just my personal belongings." The answer did nothing to mollify Blake. Without warning, he began frisking Davis, his rough hands patting down the general's pockets. A crowd began to form, neighbors stepping out onto their porches, and bystanders slowing their cars, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. "He hasn't done anything wrong," someone murmured from the shadows. "You know who that is?" "That's General Davis," another whispered, their voice tinged with disbelief. Davis remained stoic, though a flicker of frustration danced across his features. "Officer," he said calmly, "I've complied with all your requests. May I ask why I'm being detained?" Blake smirked, his handcuffs glinting under the streetlights. "You're under arrest for suspicion of trespassing and resisting an officer." The absurdity of the accusation hit Davis like a blow, but he didn't resist as the cuffs were snapped onto his wrists. The murmurs among the onlookers grew louder, outrage simmering in the crisp night air. "Are you serious?" one woman shouted, her phone aimed squarely at the scene. "He didn't do anything." Blake ignored her, gripping Davis by the arm and guiding him toward the patrol car. The general's composed demeanor didn't falter, though his jaw tightened with restrained anger. The crowd grew restless. "This is wrong," someone yelled. Phones were raised, their screens glowing as they captured every moment. In the digital age, justice often started with a single video, and this scene was no exception. Inside the cruiser, Davis sat silently, the cold steel of the handcuffs digging into his wrists. Through the tinted windows, he could see the faces of the onlookers, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and anger. He thought of his family, waiting for him at home, and the shame they might feel when they learned of his arrest. At the station, the indignity continued. Fingerprints were taken, personal belongings confiscated, and his fatigue scrutinized as if they were a disguise rather than a badge of honor. Officer Blake filled out his report with a self-satisfied smirk, while Davis waited in silence, his thoughts a storm of humiliation and disbelief. Meanwhile, outside the police station, the footage of Davis's arrest was already circulating on social media. The hashtags Justice for Davis and End Racial Profiling began trending within hours. Strangers rallied behind the general, their anger amplifying the injustice. Back in the holding cell, Davis leaned against the cold concrete wall, the weight of the night settling on his shoulders. He had faced countless battles, but this one felt different. This was a fight not against an external enemy, but against the systemic injustice that had been allowed to thrive in his own country. The murmur of voices outside the station grew louder. Protesters gathered, their chants piercing the night. Davis closed his eyes, drawing on the discipline that had carried him through the worst of times. He didn't know what the next hours would hold, but one thing was certain: this was far from over. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a call to action for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system, a rallying cry for justice and accountability. And as the echoes of protest reached his ears, Davis knew the tide was beginning to turn. The fallout from General Marcus Davis's arrest was swift and unrelenting. Within hours of the incident, shaky phone footage captured by a bystander had gone viral. The video revealed every excruciating detail: Officer Paul Henderson's sharp tone, his unwarranted escalation, and the moment he forced a decorated army general to the ground in handcuffs. The sight of Davis, calm yet visibly humiliated, struck a chord with viewers. The hashtags Justice for General Davis and End Police BS flooded social media platforms, spreading like wildfire. Outrage wasn't confined to the internet. News outlets picked up the story, replaying the clip alongside Davis's distinguished record, multiple commendations, tours in combat zones, and a career spent serving his country. Anchors highlighted the irony of his treatment, a man who risked his life for freedom being stripped of his dignity on his own soil. At home, Davis's family watched the events unfold with a mixture of anger, fear, and heartbreak. His wife, Angela, paced the living room as the news coverage cycled on repeat. Their teenage son, Jordan, clenched his fists in frustration. "Why?" Jordan demanded, his voice trembling. Why does this keep happening to us? Doesn't Dad's service mean anything? Angela wrapped her arms around her son, but her voice broke as she whispered, I wish I had answers, sweetheart. For years, Angela had prepared herself for the dangers Marcus faced overseas. What she hadn't prepared for was this, a domestic attack on his character by the very system he'd dedicated his life to protecting. That night, as Davis finally returned home after being released without charges, Angela pulled him into a long embrace. You didn't deserve this, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Davis nodded, his composure still intact, but Angela saw the weariness in his eyes. We'll get through this, he said, though his words felt more like a promise to himself than to her. Meanwhile, in New York, former President Donald Trump was briefed on the situation by one of his senior aides. Sitting in a high-backed chair in his office, Trump's usual bravado softened as the aide played the now viral video. Trump leaned forward, his expression growing stormy as the footage showed Davis being handcuffed and mocked. The officer's words, your rank doesn't mean anything here, echoed in Trump's mind. This is unacceptable, Trump said, slamming his palm on the desk. A man like that, an army general, treated like a criminal. What's wrong with these people? The aide hesitated. Sir, the story is gaining momentum. Social media is calling for action, and veterans groups are rallying behind him. It's becoming a national issue. Trump nodded, his tone decisive. Get me his number. I'm calling him personally. Across the country, people from all walks of life expressed their fury. Veterans organizations released statements condemning the treatment of General Davis, calling it a disgrace to those who serve. Community leaders organized protests, holding signs that read, No justice, no peace and respect our heroes. In neighborhoods, coffee shops, and offices, conversations about racial profiling reached a boiling point. If they can do this to an army general, one protester said during a news broadcast, what chance does an ordinary black man have? Criticism of the Columbus Police Department mounted as demands for accountability grew louder. Calls flooded the department's phone lines, urging the immediate suspension of Officer Henderson. Some officers within the department felt the heat, but many quietly agreed that Henderson had crossed a line. As the story dominated headlines, Davis remained quiet, choosing to focus on his family. But he couldn't ignore the tidal wave of support or the knowledge that his ordeal had ignited something far bigger than himself. The fallout had only just begun. Late that evening, Trump sat in his gold-accented office, the phone cradled in his hand as he dialed the number his aide had provided. The line rang twice before a calm, steady voice answered. This is Marcus Davis. General Davis, this is Donald Trump, came the unexpected response. I've seen what happened to you, and I want to say up front it's unacceptable. Davis paused, the weight of the call sinking in. Mr. President, former President, I appreciate the call, but I'm not sure what you can do at this point. Trump's tone sharpened, his determination evident. I can do plenty. What happened to you isn't just wrong, it's a disgrace. No one, especially someone who's served this country with honor, should ever be treated like that. Davis, skeptical but intrigued, listened as Trump continued. I want to meet with you not just to talk but to take real action. We'll address this head on. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Will you work with me? After a moment's hesitation, Davis replied, if it leads to change, I'm in. The following morning, Trump stepped before a sea of reporters, the room buzzing with anticipation. Cameras clicked as he began. What happened to General Marcus Davis is a national disgrace. A decorated army general, a man who has risked his life for this country, was humiliated because of the color of his skin. This behavior has no place in America. The room grew quiet as Trump's words reverberated. I've spoken to General Davis. We're working together to address this injustice. I'm calling on every law enforcement agency in this country to reevaluate their practices. Veterans deserve our respect, and racial profiling must end. Reporters bombarded him with questions. One voice rose above the rest. Mr. Trump, some critics question your motivations, given your history on race-related issues. How do you respond? Trump's expression hardened. This isn't about politics. This is about doing what's right. If we can't stand up for a man like General Davis, then what kind of country are we? His speech quickly dominated the news cycle, sparking intense debate. Some praised Trump's boldness, seeing his actions as a necessary step forward. Others doubted his intentions, calling it a calculated move to rebuild his image. For veterans, though, the message was clear. Statements flooded in, thanking Trump for taking a stand. Social media lit up with hashtags like Justice for General Davis, amplifying calls for accountability and reform. Trump's announcement of a private meeting with Davis and his family added fuel to the national conversation. The public eagerly awaited the outcome, their hopes pinned on this unlikely collaboration. In a rare interview, Davis spoke candidly. "I'm not here for empty gestures. This is about ensuring no one else endures what I went through. Words are a start, but actions are what matter." Trump, too, reaffirmed his commitment in his own interview. "We're going to come up with real solutions. I won't back down from this." As the meeting approached, the nation watched with bated breath. The stakes were high, and the collaboration between Trump and Davis promised to challenge and redefine how America confronted systemic injustice. The viral footage of General Marcus Davis's arrest ignited a firestorm. The Columbus Police Department was thrust into the national spotlight, facing demands for accountability and transparency. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, the department announced the launch of an internal investigation into Officer Paul Henderson's actions. For many, this was a long overdue step, but for others, it felt like the bare minimum. Henderson was placed on administrative leave, but the public wasn't satisfied. "Leave isn't enough," one protester said during a televised interview. "He needs to be fired. He humiliated a man who has served this country selflessly." The protests outside the Columbus Police Department grew larger with each passing day. The streets became a sea of people holding signs that read "No justice, no peace, and respect our veterans." Men and women of all backgrounds, young and old, united under a common cause. The chants of justice for Marcus echoed, capturing the city's energy and frustration. Angela Davis, standing by her husband's side, was moved to tears when she saw the outpouring of support. "This isn't just about Marcus," she said during an impromptu interview. "It's about every person who has been judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character." Meanwhile, Henderson refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. In a statement to his superiors, he claimed, "I followed procedure." General Davis was uncooperative and evasive, but the footage painted a different picture, one of a calm man wrongfully treated and an officer whose actions reeked of bias. As the days passed, Henderson's denial only fanned the flames of public anger. Reporters hounded him outside his home, while his colleagues quietly distanced themselves. Still, he stood firm, adamantly defending his actions. "This has been blown out of proportion," he told a local news channel. "I was doing my job." The investigation moved quickly under the weight of public scrutiny. The department sifted through Henderson's record, uncovering complaints of excessive force and racially charged interactions. This only added fuel to the fire, as protesters demanded not just Henderson's dismissal, but also systemic reforms to prevent such incidents from recurring. Inside the police department, tension simmered. Some officers resented the public outcry, feeling that they were all being vilified for Henderson's actions. Others recognized the need for change, quietly supporting the push for accountability. The city reached a boiling point when an elderly veteran joined the protests, standing silently with a sign that read, "Marcus Davis fought for my freedom. Now I fight for his dignity." The image of the man, frail but resolute, went viral, further amplifying calls for justice. Behind the scenes, city officials scrambled to address the fallout. Meetings were held, press releases drafted, and community leaders consulted. But nothing could douse the collective anger until tangible actions were taken. For Henderson, the walls were closing in. Isolated and defiant, he remained unwilling to admit his mistakes, even as his career hung by a thread. But the tide of public opinion had turned irrevocably against him. The question was no longer if he would face consequences, but when. The grandeur of the White House stood as a stark contrast to the chaos that had unraveled days before. General Marcus Davis and his family were escorted through its historic halls, their expressions a mix of gratitude and caution. They had been invited for a private meeting with former President Donald Trump, an invitation they had initiated to accept. However, the promise of addressing systemic issues that plagued veterans and minority communities convinced them that this was a discussion worth having. In the Oval Office, Trump stood waiting. His usual air of bravado was tempered, replaced with a thoughtful demeanor that matched the gravity of the situation. He extended a firm handshake to General Davis. "General Davis," Trump began, his voice steady, "I've read about your service, and I want to start by saying that what happened to you should never have happened to anyone, let alone someone who's dedicated their life to this country." Davis nodded, appreciating the sentiment but keeping his response measured. Thank you, Mr. President. This isn't just about me, though. It's about a system that allows prejudice to go unchecked, even against those in uniform. For the next hour, the conversation flowed candidly. Davis shared personal stories of the discrimination he and others had faced within and outside the military. His wife, Angela, added her perspective, painting a vivid picture of the impact these biases had on their family. Trump listened intently, occasionally nodding or interjecting with questions. Trump's aides had briefed him thoroughly, and he was well aware of the public pressure mounting around this incident. Yet, as he heard the first-hand account of Davis's ordeal, he seemed genuinely moved. "This isn't just a police issue," Davis said firmly. "It's a cultural issue. Bias exists everywhere in law enforcement, the military, education, and beyond. We need more than apologies, we need action." Trump leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Action is what I'm here to discuss, General. I've spoken with several advisors, and I want to propose reforms that will make a real difference." Angela spoke up, her voice soft but resolute. "Reforms are only as good as their enforcement, Mr. President. People need to feel the change, not just hear about it." Trump nodded. "Agreed. That's why I'm announcing a new initiative today, mandatory bias training for law enforcement and government employees, as well as stricter oversight for incidents like this. And General, I'd like your input to ensure these measures are effective." Davis hesitated, surprised by the offer. "If this leads to meaningful change, then I'd be honored to contribute." The meeting concluded with a sense of cautious optimism. Trump and Davis emerged from the Oval Office together, their handshake captured by photographer and soon broadcast nationwide. A joint press conference followed. Cameras clicked incessantly as the two men stood side by side at the podium. Trump opened with a strong statement. "What happened to General Davis was unacceptable. We owe our veterans respect, dignity, and fairness not just in words, but in actions. Today, I'm committing to reforms that ensure incidents like this are addressed swiftly and never repeated." General Davis stepped forward next, his composed presence commanding attention. "This moment isn't about me, it's about all of us. Change doesn't happen because of one person, it happens when we stand together, demand accountability, and refuse to accept injustice as normal. I'm hopeful that this collaboration can set a precedent for how we approach systemic issues moving forward." The press conference ended with applause, though reactions across the nation varied. Some praised the unusual partnership as a step toward unity, while others remained skeptical of Trump's motivations. Regardless, the moment was undeniably impactful. In the days following, Trump's office released detailed plans for reform, and Davis was invited to help oversee their implementation. For Davis and his family, the fight was far from over, but this was a significant step in the right direction. For Trump, it was a rare opportunity to bridge divides, showing that leadership meant listening, learning, and acting decisively when it mattered most. The public response to the joint press conference was swift and divided. As news outlets replayed clips of Trump and General Davis standing united, praising their unexpected alliance, criticism and support poured in from all corners of the nation. While many lauded the collaboration as a necessary step toward justice, others, particularly law enforcement representatives, saw it as a betrayal. Behind the scenes, tensions rose within the police union. Statements condemning Trump's remarks surfaced almost immediately, accusing him of undermining the integrity of law enforcement. Union leaders declared that calling out one officer's misconduct painted the entire force in an unfair light. They warned of a chilling effect on officers already hesitant to make critical decisions in the field. Trump, never one to back down, responded directly to the criticism. Speaking to reporters outside his Florida residence, he doubled down. Accountability is not anti-police. It's pro-justice. If we want the people to trust the police have to earn it every day. While his words drew applause from social justice advocates, they sparked outrage among some conservatives who felt he was pandering to public sentiment. The backlash didn't deter Trump, and his rhetoric grew sharper. He repeated a line that quickly became iconic. "We can't claim to be the land of the free if we allow injustice to go unchecked." Meanwhile, Elizabeth Davis, Marcus's wife, quietly emerged as a voice of hope and education. A former educator and community leader, Elizabeth recognized the opportunity to address bias at its root. She partnered with local schools to develop workshops and classroom sessions focused on empathy, diversity, and understanding. Her soft-spoken demeanor and thoughtful insights resonated with students and parents alike. One classroom discussion on the value of compassion and accountability gained traction on social media after a video clip was shared. In it, Elizabeth spoke directly to a room full of teenagers. Hate doesn't grow overnight. It starts small, an assumption, a stereotype. But just like hate can be learned, so can love and respect. Elizabeth's efforts were covered by local and national media. Parents wrote letters to thank her for bringing light to their children's understanding of prejudice and systemic bias. She quickly became a local hero, representing the quiet but powerful shift in perspective that the protests had sparked. The events surrounding General Davis's arrest and Trump's involvement reached a fever pitch as debates raged across television panels and online platforms. For many, the issue was no longer just about Henderson or Davis, it was about a nation grappling with its deeply entrenched biases. With Elizabeth and Trump both working in their respective spheres, a sense of change began to ripple through the community. While protests continued to call for justice and reforms, there was a growing acknowledgement that this moment could mark the beginning of lasting transformation. As public and private dialogues merged into a powerful national discourse, a realization crystallized. This was no longer just about an incident in Columbus, it was a fight for a more equitable future. The internal investigation into Officer Henderson's actions concluded, and the findings were damning. It was clear that his behavior during General Davis's arrest stemmed from racial bias. The report detailed multiple protocol violations, including excessive force and unwarranted escalation. Under immense public pressure, the police department announced Henderson's termination. The decision, though welcomed by activists and many in the community, also brought mixed reactions. Some in law enforcement circles labeled it a political sacrifice, but the majority agreed it was a step toward accountability. For General Davis, Henderson's firing brought a small sense of closure, but also highlighted the broader issue. This isn't just about one officer losing his job, he told reporters in a brief statement. It's about ensuring no one else experiences what I did. That's where the real work begins. As the community digested the news, local leaders pushed forward with reforms. The Columbus Police Department introduced a slate of new measures, including mandatory racial bias training, de-escalation workshops, and stricter oversight mechanisms. The changes, though incremental, were seen as a victory for the movement that had grown from Davis's experience. Meanwhile, the streets that once swelled with protests saw a different kind of gathering. Community members from all walks of life came together to paint a mural in downtown Columbus, honoring General Davis and the resilience he embodied. The artwork depicted Davis in his military uniform, standing tall against a backdrop of unity and hope. It became a powerful symbol for the city, drawing visitors and sparking conversations about progress and justice. For Trump, the fallout from his involvement continued to shape his narrative. Letters from veterans, activists, and everyday citizens flooded his office, many thanking him for standing with General Davis. This isn't about politics, one letter read. It's about doing what's right, and for once you did. In a reflective moment captured during an interview, Trump spoke candidly about the incident. I didn't set out to lead a movement, he admitted. But when I saw what happened to General Davis, I couldn't stay silent. He's a hero, and heroes deserve better. The events surrounding Davis's arrest and Trump's intervention became a turning point for the nation, sparking deeper discussions about race, respect, and the role of law enforcement. Though the journey was far from over, there was a palpable sense that this chapter had brought meaningful progress. As General Davis stood before the completed mural, his family by his side, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This isn't the end, he said softly. It's just the beginning. General Marcus Davis stood at the steps of a memorial dedicated to fallen soldiers, his gaze fixed on the names etched into the marble. The early morning sunlight cast a golden hue across the serene park, and a quiet breeze carried the faint sound of birdsong. Clad in his formal military attire, Davis exuded the dignity and resilience that had defined his life and career. As he traced a finger over the engraved names, he thought about the sacrifices these men and women had made for their country. It reminded him of his own journey from a young boy growing up with dreams of service to becoming a decorated general. The recent incident with Officer Henderson lingered in his mind, a stark reminder of the battles still to be fought on home soil. His wife Angela approached with their teenage son, Jordan, and daughter, Ella. They stood silently beside him, offering strength in their presence. "Dad," Jordan finally said, his voice filled with emotion, "I'm proud of you, not just for what you've done in the military, but for standing up for what's right." Davis placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his voice steady but soft. "Thank you, son. But this fight isn't just mine. It's for all of us." Across the country, reforms were underway. Police departments had begun implementing stricter guidelines for de-escalation and bias training, influenced by the changes sparked by Davis's ordeal. Community leaders used the momentum to build bridges and open dialogue, ensuring the conversation didn't end with the protests. Meanwhile, in his office, Trump sat reviewing the reforms and their nationwide ripple effects. A rare moment of introspection crossed his face as he considered the role he had played in amplifying the issue. He tapped his pen against the desk and murmured, "Sometimes, standing up for the right thing isn't about politics, it's about people." The press later captured Trump standing before a crowd of veterans and their families, addressing the need for continued accountability and respect for all those who served the country. His words carried a weight that surprised many, a reflection of the impact the incident had left on him. As Davis left the memorial that day, he felt lighter, though the journey was far from over. He looked back one last time. The names of the fallen a silent reminder of the sacrifices made in pursuit of justice and freedom. The screen faded to black, displaying a single, powerful message. Justice is not a privilege, it is a right. Together, we stand stronger.